Those of you that know Casablanca Restaurant in Venice. Okay, who's the owner-operator of Casablanca Restaurant in Venice?
Mr. Blanca.
No. No, nobody knows that Carlos Aro is the owner-operator of Casablanca Restaurant in Venice. Carlos Aro. He's my tocayo. We both come from Sonora, but different. We don't know if there's a blood relation. All right. Carlos Aro and Casablanca Restaurant are catering the 5:30 reception, so there's going to be some good food. And we are also going to have an open bar. Oh, I see some people. Now you're interested. Now you're interested. Okay, that's at 5:30. Ongoing next door. Next door is an art exhibit by a very important artist for us, Ignacio Gomez. Ignacio Gomez produced the cover art for the program that you have today. Right? Go see Ignacio during the break that we'll have after this session. He is also selling some of his art. And Ignacio is important in another sense. He's one of the volunteers that goes up to the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference and talks to the high school students. He is there every year, every year. Now, in addition, our next panel is going to include a woman that was one of Sal's high school students, who is now a doctorate and involved in education, Robin Avelar La Salle. And we also are going to have Mario Garcia, who is a historian, but he writes biographies, and one of them was a biography on Carmona. Bert Corona, the Bert Corona bio. He is doing a biography on Sal Castro, and he'll be reflecting on that. But in the program for today, for today's event, there is a research note authored by Professor Garcia, and this is the first offering of several years of research. So we're very pleased that he was able to contribute to our program with that research note, and we're looking forward to the release of his large manuscript, large book on Sal Castro. Now I'll turn it over to Robin.
Okay, so is he in the room? Where is he? Where, outside? No, I'm not starting if he's not in the room. Go get him. Go get him. Well, Mr. Castro asked me to come to speak at the Chicano Youth Leadership, there he is, conferences all the time, and on gender issues, and I have to give personal stories of high school, many of which Castro would reprimand me for while I was there, and I don't want him to be proven right, so he's never allowed in the room when I'm speaking. He has to get out. But this time he can come, so you have to be here now. It's the first and only time you're ever going to hear me talk about you. I was a student of Mr. Castro's, and he'll always be known as Castro. When we get familiar, it's Castro. Not Mr., just Castro. I will never call him Sal. That would be very disrespectful. In 1978, that's significant because it's 10 years after the blowouts. I was supposed to take honors or AP history, but people were talking about this class with this teacher down the hall, Castro's class, and everybody was in it who was anybody, and so I wanted to be in it. And I remember going to the counselor and saying, I want to take Castro's history class, and she said, oh no, that one's not for you. Very similar to what you said earlier. That one's not for you, that's for other kids. And I said, well, what other kids? Well, kids that aren't going to college. I said, but why is that? It's a regular high school class still. And I think my class that I was scheduled for didn't say honors, but it had different kids in it. All I know is the only Latina in the class. And I was so tired of that. So I don't know, I wanted to be where all the kids were. After all, I had an obligation to be popular. I was drill team captain. So it was my duty. So I demanded my rights, my first level of assertion, and I ended up in Castro's class. The first thing you notice is his class was always way down the hall, so you have to walk a long way down Belmont corridors. And the closer you got, the more you started to hear the conga drums, because when yeah, you know what I'm talking about. When you walk into his rooms, he's playing the Chicano national anthem, Santana, always. Santana is playing when you walk into his class, always. So you kind of say, okay. And this is during the sort of rock and roll, Stairway to Heaven times, and he's playing, chunta chunta. But it felt really good for some reason. Then, you're in his class because he sits you down, he takes roll. It's always very official, very formal. He stands and always behind a podium, very traditionally, and he would call out our names. But he would say, Robin Avelar. And it would take me a minute to say, oh, he's talking to me, Robin Avelar. And every once in a while, I would notice, oh, that's right. I remember they used to call me that. Like before school, Avelar, okay, I'm Avelar in this room. Next door, I'm Avelar, but here I'm Avelar, okay. And he would change everybody's name. He would take, you may have read in the program, he would take like Chris, cool Chris, and he'd call him Cristobal. And the only thing we'd ever heard in Chris's name other than Chris was Cristobal, like Cristobal. So we thought his name was Cristobal. And it was Cristobal in his room, okay. And then Smokey, Smokey? Every school has a Smokey. Sometimes they're called Chuco or something, but Smokey, and his name was Jesus. Don't you beat that, Jesus? Big old baldy named Jesus. And in that room, he was Jesus. We had a girl named Millie Zapata, and he would call her Emiliana Chancla. Miss Chancla, do you know the answer to this question? And she's like, okay. So anyway, there was something very unique about being in that class, and it was called U.S. History. So I remember every day waiting for the U.S. history part. But we got a lot of other stuff, like opinions. For example, what are the rules on quinceañeras? Castro rules. These are rules to live by Castro. To have or not to have? Not to have. Taboo. No quinceañeras. Because for the money that you spend on a quinceañera, that's your college education. And what you're doing symbolically is saying to the world that you're ready to become dominated by a male-dominated quack, quack, quack. It's like, gosh, I just wanted a white dress. I didn't know it had all this major significance. What about the rule about getting married? Oh, no. After college. And not until he can buy you that big fat ring. So he would always say, you got a boyfriend? Oh, yeah. Can he buy you a ring? Well, not yet. Then you can't marry him. And it seems simplistic, but really, if you can't afford something substantive, like a very nice diamond ring, you can't afford to be married. So then we went around asking the guys, can you buy me a ring? No. Can you buy me a ring? No. Okay. So that was a rule by Castro. What about the rule about cars? Do you work and buy cars? Do you work and buy stuff when you're in school? No, absolute rules to live by Castro. You don't go to work, you study. And he would say, I know about all you guys that you don't study, instead you go to work and you buy cars, and we always see you down the street as we're driving, you're parked, shining, buffing your really nice car with your really nice rims. How come we never see you driving it? Because you can't afford the gas, because you don't have an education. You have no money. So you're gonna buy stuff, you gotta go to school. So it was that, we got a lot of that. And then thrown in there, we would have these quizzes on US history, and I would think, woo, where did that come from? But it would be things like spell the original name of Los Angeles. Los Angeles. First of all, it's not Los Angeles. It is. No, you misinformed people. It's Nuestra Señora, la Reina de Los Ángeles de Porciúncula. And you better not forget the accent on the uncula. Points taken off. And then we would talk about street names like Pico, Figueroa, Sepulveda. No. Those are Pico, Figueroa, and Sepulveda, and those were original founders of California, and they were Mexican, and they were all the original documents were bilingual, and nobody's doing us a favor by giving us anything here, because we were here first. In fact, we're polite to even let them be here. And I believe that was a true or false question. So he even got into ways that we carried ourselves. He would scrutinize our clothes. He would scrutinize our demeanor, our speech, and he would say, the way that people perceive you are the way that is the way that you will be treated, and those are the opportunities that you will have. So you need to know when to turn it on and when to turn it off. And if he saw us, God forbid, or goodness forbid, if he saw us on the flats, on the benches, hanging out with the guys, and anything that he seemed to think was inappropriate, and that was a lot, we would hear about it in class. He'd walk in, he'd take roll, Robin Avelar, presente. I didn't like the way in front of everybody. And we would think, aren't there rules? Isn't there like teacher rules you can't do to kids? But they didn't apply in that room. But in any event, that was my experience with Mr. Castro. And one of the things you learn is that over time, no matter what he says, if he says you can't wear that, you don't wear that. If he says you can't say that, you can't say that. You wouldn't even think to argue with him. And if he says you've got to go to a four-year university, then you've got to go. What are you going to do? I remember that in our class, we had research reports. And the things we read, I don't even remember reading our textbook. To be honest, I remember it was heavy. That's my experience with the textbook. But I do remember reading Occupied America. That was what we had to read. And I remember, Castro, our teacher's in this book, our teacher's in this book. And he said yes, and a lot of other people as well. We had to read Among the Valiant, about how patriotic we are actually as a community and the sacrifices that we've made above and beyond the call. And we had research projects just like everybody else, only he made us pick from a list. And on that list was something called the blowouts. And I was very anti-drug, and I was not going to do anything on the blowouts. And he had this system where he'd sit us outside of class and call us up one by one. I'm like, why don't you just tell everybody everything in class? No, in Castro's class, there's this conference table. He'd have us do something in class, and he'd call us outside one by one. Robin, Avelar, my turn. So you go outside and sit there, and he would talk to us about a research project. But first, he would talk to us about what we were wearing and whether we were having quinceañeras and all that. And then, when all was said and done, he said, now, you're going to do a project. You have a choice from this list, and the choice you're going to make is the blowouts. Okay, Mr. Castro, but I'm not a druggie. I don't do drugs. If you're trying to teach me an anti-drug message, you're wasting it. Tell Jesus. He needs to hear that. No, mija, you need to get this book, Occupied America, and okay. So started to read about it and thought, oh my gosh, oh my goodness, how come I didn't know this? Where was only 10 years ago? Why didn't I know this? And in fact, we wrote the research paper, presented it, and started to read the original source documents, because all of you who were there then, you wrote stuff down. You're very prolific writers, and there were writings that we got our hands on, and a group of us in his class started to say, you know what, it's 10 years later, Belmont High School, we still don't have teachers who represent us here. I am still the only Latina in my advanced classes. The fact that we even have advanced and non-advanced is a problem. ASB? No. I could be drill team captain, but president of the school? No. We have our places. Although drill team captain does supersede ASB president in my mind, of the swinging sweethearts particularly. And so we got angry, and we remember going to Castro and saying, Castro, this is not right. This is not right. That was the first of many times in my life from then on that I would say, this is not right. And he'd say, okay, what do you want to do about it? Well, they did this blowout thing. I think we want one of those. So I remember, I want to do that. So I remember getting groups together. We met at the park. We made it feel as clandestine as possible just to get that 60s rush in the 70s. And this is during disco time, so it's kind of hard to get that activist feeling in the, ooh, ooh. But we did, and we met in the park in the cover of darkness, and, moms dropped us off and picked us up. It's not so safe. But anyway, we made buttons, and we said 10-year anniversary of the blowouts, and we picked a date and a time and all that. Well, I was interested to see the movie because that turncoat in the movie, ours was a little guy, a football player. So he got scared. I won't tell you his name. Chente. And so he got scared. Darn it. And he told, and next thing you know, it's time, blow up, blow up. So we walked out, and we looked up, because Belmont has these very high roofs, and there were snipers, police, in full riot gear, pointing these guns at us. And we looked, and we're like, God, what would they have done 10 years ago? Well, they would have kept going. And we looked at each other, and we turned around and went right back into class. We couldn't do it. We couldn't do it. And so we felt so cowardly and so small and so awful for so long. And we went back to class, and we're looking for consolation. Castro, we couldn't do it. They were going to shoot us. He said, well, what do you want to do? Mija, what do you want to do? And as we were thinking about it, the solution and I'll always be ashamed that I didn't take on those snipers. I should have thrown a rock or something. I should have done something. But in the end, what we all decided in that group, and this was supposed to be the non-college group, except for I was the anointed one, I guess, was that we would work from that point on from the inside out. We were gonna work from the system. We were gonna get ourselves into college and go all the way, hence the PhD, not an EDD, if you know about that kind of stuff. Like, I could care less, but it matters later. From Stanford, not wherever else. And we were gonna be so darn credible that when we did our business and looked for trouble, people would have to listen. So that's what we did. We have attorneys, we have many school administrators, we've got people who are on all professions, all fighting the fight, and that's our way, 10 years later, of attacking the fight. The shame never leaves, however. So maybe it just makes us work that much harder every day. So my path was, I ended up being a bilingual teacher. From my classroom, I was frustrated that the inequities were school-wide, so I decided I wanted to go and continue my education. I got the doctorate, came back, ended up being an administrator so I could handle a school. A school wasn't big enough because there were inequities in the district. I ended up at the district office, tried to fix that. That frustrated me because from that they went to other districts that didn't have any champions, and so on. I went to the university to train the people who were going to work at the schools, who were going to work at the district. Got frustrated by that. I just keep quitting jobs. I can't keep a job. So in the end, 9 years ago, I formed a group along with Estela Ramirez, who's standing right here, if I could have her say hello, and my husband as well, who did buy me a very nice ring. Very nice requirement. Thank you very much. And I won't walk back there because I know you can see it from there. And we formed this group called Principals Exchange, and what we are now is a state-approved, see, because we work from within the system, we're a state-approved external evaluation group that works with underperforming schools. That would be 9 out of 10 schools in California. There's plenty of work, unfortunately, with high minority, high Latino, high poverty. That would be all but 3 in the state, pretty much, schools. And what we do is now we are asked, people come to us, and this is the irony of all ironies. We're in a position where people come to us and say, you know, Robin, we have a problem. We suspect that Latino students aren't doing well here. We think that might be the case. And this could be any district, any number. So I'm not talking about any particular district. It replicates itself over and over again. Can you help figure out why? We say certainly. So the first thing we do is we study the site. So we ask the people there, we ask the students, we ask the staff, we ask administration why it is that Latino students are underperforming. And we get all the reasons. And so in case you were wondering why Latino students are underperforming, let me tell you why. Based on my field study from the people in charge of our students, a primary reason is that our parents. Apparently we have parents. And that's a bad thing. Our parents don't value education, don't care about us, don't motivate us, want us to be married, want the boys to work at McDonald's. I don't know what they want, but they don't want us to go to school. So that's the number one fact. Tell your neighbor if they really believe that I meant fact, okay? Clarify that for somebody next door. The second reason is I was told this, and these are direct quotes, you don't understand. There's this one setting where they identify students at the elementary school who are gifted and talented. Heavy have and have not kind of county. And so some schools are completely Mexican Chicano, other schools are completely white, Asian, something else. And so we have 10% of each of the schools send up to the middle schools gifted and talented students. Well, don't you know that when you get to the middle school, Mexican kids lose their giftedness? They're no longer gifted because they retest them. They retest them and decide they're no longer gifted. And I have to say, so you were intelligent when you were 9, but when you're 11, you get dumb? And you can measure that? First of all, the fact that someone said you were intelligent is in question in the first place, whether you are or aren't. But how can that be? And so I had somebody in charge of this entire district explain to me, what you don't understand here is our reality. I agree with you. It's unbelievable. It's remarkable. But we have the bell curve, right? And she got up and drew the bell curve in front of an auditorium of people. We generally have everybody of intelligence somewhere in the middle, those very, very bright and those very, very stupid, I think is the word she used, over here. This is a person in charge of this. Here we have two communities. The wealthier community, they're all white in this particular case. They're skewed, their entire curve is skewed to the right. So the average IQ of that community is well above the average IQ of a typical population. That is a proven fact. Conversely, and I said, oh, please don't finish that. Please don't finish it, and she finished it. She drew the curve over here. Our other population, euphemism for Mexican Chicano kids, has a bell curve over here where the average IQ is significantly lower than that of the average population. And that's just a fact. I wish it were different. And it's just our burden to bear. So we do the best we can. I said, damn, I remember when they took us on a field trip to the Museum of Science and Industry, there's these marbles that fall. Do you remember marbles? Even marbles fall in the bell curve and the middle ones are in the middle. We can't even be marbles? We're not even as typical as marbles? How can that be? So they would explain their unlabeling of students as gay. I've heard this exact quote: you don't understand, it's not their fault. There's just two kinds of people. You're either built for school or not built for school. And these are people in high positions of power. So high that their authority is difficult to fathom. And other quotes, when arguing about why don't we get more students in the college-bound track? Well, so you're willing to sacrifice quality for quantity. That's what you're saying, Robin? Do you get that? Like, there's so much wrong with that, I don't even know where to start. The wonderful thing about all of this is that today we are paid, and paid very well, to be asked to come to schools and districts as experts in this area. So we paid, which is very, very important, to come to these areas that have no advocacy, to look for trouble. So we don't have to hide under the cover of night in the park and make buttons anymore. We are actually solicited as experts to come and give our professional assessment of what's going on. And so now, one of the most recent reports reads like this. And this is an official report that goes to superintendent, board, the Pope, and anybody else who's responsible. So why Latino students are underperforming, and in this case it happens to be all Chicano and Mexican. Among other things, there's also a widespread perception that Hispanics don't care about school and are unmotivated and apathetic about academic success. Those people that said that didn't think it was gonna come out, they're not happy today. Also pervasive is the perception that Hispanic parents are not pushing students to be successful and are not involved in their students' academic decisions. This perception, again, results in a passive approach to programming and student support based on the perceived inevitability of Hispanic student low level of achievement. And so here's the bottom line of this 40-page report. Currently, the district's secondary program has evolved into a quasi-school within a school structure, where some students, mostly white, are enrolled in premium courses for the majority of their secondary careers starting at middle school. Enrollment in those classes offers exceptional opportunities to gain content knowledge, as well as prized social capital essential to academic pursuits. Hispanic students, in contrast, are primarily enrolled in lesser classes, often for the entirety of their secondary experience, with little likelihood of improving their academic standing or access to social capital necessary for academic success, shared so readily among students in the advanced classes. And on it goes. The funny thing is, people thank us for this. When I was in high school, we got in trouble for this. There were snipers. Did I tell you they had guns? They were up there ready to shoot us because we were going to speak our minds. Now, we're legitimate, we are inside, we are qualified, credible, and we are solicited to search for inequities. So that very first time I told Castro, that's wrong. That was just one of many, and that's what we do. Our professional life is spent searching out for those wrongs and setting ourselves up to be able to do something. And I'm proud to say that in almost every district that solicits our information, great things are happening for students that otherwise never would have happened, not because of us, but because we happen to represent what we do, and we're in a position to help. So today, I'm here because Castro called, and whenever he calls, you kind of hear that it's like the Godfather. Mija, like, oh no. And often not not a lot of notice, but we do what we can. And so, Castro, you're calling me right now again, and you're saying, Robin Avelar, and I'm saying, presente to you before, presente now, and presente forever.
It's a very hard act to follow Professor Avelar's or Dr. Avelar's presentation, and I'll try to stick to my 30 minutes. I want to first thank Carlos Haro for the invitation and the UCLA Chicano Studies Research Center to be here with you. I want to thank and Sal Castro as well for the invitation. I want to dedicate this presentation to Sal Castro. My more formal presentation is entitled Pedagogy of Chicano Power, Sal Castro, Paulo Freire, and the Mexican-American Youth Leadership Conference, 1963 to 1968. Blowout, blowout, one high school student began to call out on a sunny spring day in 1968. Soon thousands more echoed the call. This commenced what came to be called the blowouts. These Chicano high school and junior high school students walked out of the East Los Angeles public schools and demanded better education after years of unequal and inferior schooling in segregated so-called Mexican schools. Standing in the halls on that first full day of the blowouts, teacher Sal Castro looked on with pride and emotion as his students took up the call to take their future into their own hands. Tears snaked down from his eyes. These were his kids, and he was proud of them. There's no question in my mind that the blowouts would not have occurred without the galvanizing and inspiring figure of Sal Castro, one of the few Mexican-American teachers in the East Side schools and in the LA school district at the time. It was Sal, as he is popularly referred to, who came up with the idea of the walkouts, and through his leadership and that of the students, pulled it off. The blowouts were a defining moment for him and for the students who participated. As Carlos Munoz correctly notes, the walkouts inaugurated the urban Chicano and cultural rights movement. But were these blowouts the result of the spontaneity that 1960s New Left political culture favored, or was it something else? The blowouts were definitely not spontaneous. Much planning had gone into this dramatic action. For weeks, Sal, working both with the high school student leaders and some of the Chicano college students, most of them who had attended the East LA schools, had been organizing for the walkouts. Yet the origins of one of the most important episodes in the history of the Chicano movement had even deeper roots. These roots were planted in what came to be known as the Chicano Youth Leadership Conference, conferences during the 1960s that led up to the blowouts. I will argue in this paper that in these conferences, Sal Castro, along with the Chicano students who attended, engaged in a type of consciousness-raising dialogues identified with the work of the progressive Brazilian and Latin American educational philosopher Paulo Freire. It was these dialogues, unconsciously employing Freirean strategies and concepts, that created the concientización that led to the blowouts. Sal Castro was not aware of Freire. Indeed, Freire and his works were not well known in the United States in the 1960s. His most famous book that would inspire many liberationists throughout the world, Pedagogy of the Oppressed, was not published until 1970. Nevertheless, as I will suggest, many of Freire's concepts of how to achieve a liberating and humanistic education that will achieve progressive social change can be seen in the dialogical relationship between teacher Sal Castro on the one hand, and on the other, the Chicano students participating at the leadership conferences. The concept or theory of dialogue as proposed by Freire is important, it seems to me, as a means of analysis for three basic reasons. First, it helps us to understand the dynamics of what seemed to be occurring at the youth leadership conferences during the 1960s, and how Sal Castro and the students' version of dialogue led to a growing political Chicano consciousness that in time erupted into political protest. Second, the youth leadership dialogues in this heavily political period in US history suggest that what was happening at these conferences was very much in tune with the culture of protest of that era, rather than in isolation from it, and not only within the country, but internationally as well. What was happening at the conferences was also happening in other locations, including Latin America, where Freire initiated dialogue with peasants and urban workers. Sal Castro and the students may not have been aware of some or all of these connections, but the fact is that they were influenced by the protest and even revolutionary politics of their time, and I would propose they contributed to it. Finally, by examining the relationship of Freire to the youth leadership conferences and the progressive role that the process of dialogue played, this can make us reflect today how we are approaching education and whether our praxis is also liberating and humanistic. In Pedagogy of the Oppressed, Freire defines dialogue in the following manner. In order to understand the meaning of dialogical practice, we have to put aside the simplistic understanding of dialogue as a mere technique. On the contrary, dialogue characterizes an epistemological or learning relationship. Thus, in this sense, dialogue is a way of knowing and should never be viewed as mere tactic to involve students in a particular task. We have to make this point very clear. I engage in dialogue not necessarily because I like the other person. I engage in dialogue because I recognize the social and not merely the individualistic character of the process of knowing. In this sense, dialogue presents itself as an indispensable component of the process of both learning and knowing. While this definition does not include all of the different aspects of Freirean dialogue, and that we will explore in relationship to Sal and the youth leadership conferences, it does emphasize two key points. One is that dialogue is not just an educational strategy. It is a philosophy of liberation, or what Stanley Aronowitz calls a secular liberation theology. Dialogue not only frees the mind, it frees the human being. But, and this is the second point, this liberation is not only an individual one, but also a social one. Dialogue presupposes community and the liberation of that community through a practice of critical consciousness and social action. One of the initial tenets of Freire's pedagogy of dialogue is the role of individual and group experiences in shaping that dialogue. Dialogue does not occur in a vacuum. Each person involved brings his or her baggage of experiences that, as Freire suggests, are transferred into knowledge. These experiences lay the foundations for discussion, analysis, understanding, and action. This is clearly the case with Sal Castro. The concrete situation of individuals conditioned their consciousness of the world, Freire observes, and that in turn, this consciousness conditions their attitude and their way of dealing with reality. Hence, one needs to understand Sal's life experiences prior to the youth conferences in order to better appreciate his role in those gathering of Mexican-American students. Sal did not just appear at those meetings ready to motivate the students to participate in a dramatic action such as the blowouts. Like all of us, Sal went through a process of becoming who he was by the 1960s. The process, of course, continued as it continues even today. None of us, including Sal, ever stop becoming. This is how we constantly change. What Sal brought to these early conferences was a history of experiencing discrimination against Mexicans in Los Angeles. This profoundly affected his identity and political consciousness. Some of this information is in the research note, but I'll go through a little bit of it. Sal was born in Los Angeles on October 25th, 1933, a child of immigrant parents from Mexico who settled in the Boyle Heights barrio of East Los Angeles. Sal was too young to fully comprehend at the time the meaning of the mass deportation of Mexicans from LA during the Great Depression. but he knew that it affected him personally when his father became one of the deportees when his temporary visa expired and he became an undocumented immigrant. He returned to his native Mazatlan. Sal's mother had a valid visa but had to return to Mexico every 6 months to renew it. Sal recalls the train trips as a child that he took with his mother to visit his father in Mazatlan and for his mother to renew her visa. The stress on Sal's parents eventually led to a divorce. Because he spoke only Spanish at home, although his mother was bilingual, and because he started his education in Mazatlan due to his mother's visits, Sal knew very little English when he commenced his U.S. education at Belvedere Elementary School. As a result, he encountered discrimination at the hands of his teacher. My English wasn't so hot, he notes. I knew much more Spanish. I remember distinctly how the teacher would put me down because of my lack of English. Sit in the corner until you learn English, she scolded me. And then when Sal was 10 years old and shining shoes to earn some money on the corner of 7th and Broadway in downtown LA in 1943, he experienced the Zoot Suit riots when U.S. Navy personnel randomly attacked Chicanos wearing the infamous Zoot Suit popular at the time. They also assaulted, according to Sal, other Chicanos not wearing drapes, all of this symptomatic of wartime racial tensions, ironically during a war against fascist racism. Sal remembers all hell breaking loose and seeing police just stand by while the sailors beat Chicanos. He also recalls the curfew that local authorities imposed due to the riots and a tragic consequence that affected him personally. One kid that I knew from Belvedere, he told me, went to get a loaf of bread and went through the alley thinking he would avoid the curfew. The cop shot him in the back and killed him. He was 12 years old. Although Sal continued his education in Catholic rather than public schools, this did not mean that he was exempt from additional discrimination. At the all-boys Cathedral High School run by the Christian Brothers, he, along with most other Mexican-American students, were tracked into what was referred to as the Spanish track, compared to the Latin track with mostly Anglos. The Spanish track not only signified that these students studied Spanish and not Latin, but that this curriculum was less college-oriented. As a result, Sal observed that more Mexican-American students, in addition to regular, although at less advanced basic classes, also took industrial arts such as auto shop. After he was drafted into the Army in 1953, a year after high school graduation, Sal witnessed even more discrimination against blacks, Latinos, and Mexican-Americans such as himself. Situated in the South, he encountered the apartheid system of that region. I was in a state of shock when I got off the plane in Atlanta, he remembers. Both at the airport and at the bus station, they had 4 separate bathrooms: colored men, colored women, white men, white women, and they had 2 drinking fountains. This was all brand new to me. Sal himself, well, I'll skip one of these anecdotes. Despite these encounters with discrimination and despite his own rebellious nature, Sal, through this period of his life, did not have a developed political awareness of the reasons for this discrimination. These experiences were leading him to questions about this problem, questions that would lead to his later and greater understanding. But he first had to struggle against what he and W.E.B. Du Bois called a double consciousness. Of this, Sal notes, "I knew there was discrimination and racism. I had pride in who I was, but at the same time, I was self-blaming. The reason why all this is happening to us is our fault." Sort of a weird mindset in those days. Sal, however, began to overcome this duality when he worked by the late 1950s at public playgrounds, where he learned from the Mexican-American kids about the problems that they were experiencing in the schools. At the same time, after enrolling at Cal State Los Angeles, Sal decided to study to become a teacher. After receiving his BA in History and Education in 1961, he entered the MA program in Education, where he wrote a thesis comparing Mexican-American student performances with that of Mexican immigrant students. Moreover, as Sal, through his college classes, began to ask questions in the tradition of Paulo Freire that would lead to a more liberating consciousness, he began to have a better understanding of the structural basis for the discrimination that Mexican Americans experienced and that prevented their greater mobility. This growing awareness and political consciousness, in addition to his more outspoken personality, led Sal to confront his own education professors, who in Sal's opinion had negative and stereotypic views about Mexican American students when they addressed the problems of those students. Sal challenged these views and corrected them based on his own experience, his working with kids in the playgrounds, and his own research. By then, Sal notes of this evolution, I started feeling some of the things that they, his professors, were telling us about Mexican American kids were not necessarily true. They stereotyped the kids too much, and they were not really getting into how to motivate them. They saw all kids as white kids, and that wasn't really the facts. I remember one professor saying that when you saw in West Side Story, the movie, was the way Latino gang kids were. I said, that's bullshit. First of all, West Side Story is the figment of the imagination of a white guy. Second, if there really was a West Side Story, the Puerto Ricans would never dance to that kind of music they played in that damn movie anyway. I think that's linked to the Santana ring. That's a myth, he said. It was these experiences and others that Sal Castro brought with him as he embarked on a teaching career beginning in 1963 in the Pasadena Public Schools, then at Belmont High School, and finally at Lincoln High School, where he would organize the 68 blowouts. Sal's encounter with discrimination and racism at a personal level, and his evolving political consciousness that would lead to concienciación, to use the Freirean term, led him to understand that Mexican Americans had to shed what Sal called self-hatred, and to begin to understand that it was the system that had to be attacked as a source of the educational as well as the social problems faced by Mexican Americans and other minorities in the United States. This is what Sal would bring to the table in his encounters with Mexican American students at the Youth Leadership Conferences during the politically tumultuous period of the 60s. But to further the Freirean connection, this encounter would not be a monologue on the part of Sal. It would be a dialogue with the students, who also brought their experiences and evolving identities to the conferences. Out of this dialogue, a movable dialogue involving new students each year, would come a more critical consciousness on the part of both Sal and the students. These dialogues would involve a practice, again borrowing from Freire, that included not only reflection, but action. The action would culminate in the blowouts. I go a little bit into the history of the early years of the Camp Hess Kramer's camps, but that's been somewhat covered already. At the initial conferences, Sal encountered what Freire also did, the lack of self-esteem and even inferiority on the part of some of the students and staff. Freire notes that this is partly the result of what he calls the anti-dialogical nature of public education, whereby students are not allowed to possess a voice or positive identity. They are told what to think rather than encouraged to think. This one-way pedagogy Freire terms cultural invasion. For cultural invasion to succeed, he notes, it is essential that those invaded become convinced of their intrinsic inferiority. To compensate for this, the students and oppressed assume a form of false consciousness where they take on the views of the oppressors. They have no consciousness of their oppressed status. They possess what Freire calls a fear of freedom. Sal recalls, for example, that most of the other staff members did not have much of a critical perspective on education or the schools. Some, according to him, were self-haters who blamed Mexican Americans for their problems. They were not change agents or risk takers. The conferences themselves were structured in a very traditional and assimilationist format. Topics discussed at the early conferences included education, civic awareness, acculturation, marriage, and employment. Sal also discovered that some of the students had low opinions of themselves and of their community. Sal found himself from the very beginning having to counter these views and offering a different interpretation to the students. To shift from an anti-dialogical process to a dialogical process, Freire observes that certain steps must be taken. First is the role of the teacher. He or she must not be afraid to enter into a dialogue with the students on the basis of trust. The teacher also should not see himself or herself as possessing the truth or all knowledge. and certainly not as a liberator of the students. Very importantly, the teacher must work not for the students, but with the students. Revolutionary leaders, Freire observes, cannot think without the people, nor for the people, but only with the people. But to work with the students, the teacher must begin the dialogue by meeting the students at their level based on their experiences and knowledge. He or she must first come to them rather than the students coming up to the teacher's level. To achieve a liberating dialogue, the teacher must first develop an effective communication with the student. This in turn leads to cooperation, or what Freire terms authentic thinking. That is, the dialogical synthesis of both teacher and students. The teacher cannot think for her students, he cautions. Authentic thinking, thinking that is concerned about reality, does not take place in ivory tower isolation, but only in communication. This does not mean that the teacher necessarily takes a backseat to the students, but only that the teacher not dominate the dialogue. The teacher initiates the dialogue and helps to direct it by his or her critical intervention. In this dialogue, the students play a critical and equal role with the teacher. They bring their experiences and knowledge to the process. Discarding their passivity, they get the chance, as Freire puts it, to name the world. The important thing from the point of view of liberation education, Freire stresses, is for the people to come to feel like masters of their thinking by discovering the thinking and views of the world explicitly and implicitly manifest in their own suggestions and those of their comrades. These Freirean concepts of liberation education can be detected in the relationship of Sal Castro with the Chicano students at the Camp Hess-Kramer Conference of the 1960s. While Sal shared his experiences with the students, he did not impose his views on them. He worked to establish a dialogue with them so that they could teach themselves, and he would also learn from them. The kids learned from each other, Paula Chrysostomou recalls. Although some perhaps have the view that Sal Castro from the very beginning was the key director of the conferences, in fact, as he explains, he was always behind the scenes in working with the kids, at least in the 1960s. He did his work with them and dialogued with them in the small group discussion sessions, in informal bus sessions, and in table hopping at meal times where he could reach other students. In the small group encounters, Sal did not do all of the talking. That went against his pedagogy. He didn't need to talk because many of the students took the lead in discussing and sharing school problems. I would throw out something and let it spin, he says. They talked about problems in the schools, and they all had the same problems, he adds. The format of these discussion groups aided such student participation by stressing that counselors such as Sal prioritize student discourse and provide a safe place for students to open up. When the students asked his views or if they diverted from the main points, only then would Sal reinforce the dialogue and try to put it in an even more critical perspective. Guiding Sal's pedagogy was his overall philosophy about the conferences. What I wanted out of these conferences, he emphasizes, was a positive self-image and self-confidence for the students so that they would go on ahead and know who the real enemy was and go on to achieve and go on to college despite the lack of encouragement by the schools. He also hoped and expected that the Camp Hess-Kramer graduates would later in life provide leadership for the Mexican-American community as a way of giving back to it, but all this not as apologists of the system, but as critics of it. In a way, without knowing it, Sal was adopting a Saul Alinsky philosophy of not working with the system, but within it. The dialogues at Camp Hess-Kramer in the pre-blowout years consisted of the shared experiences between Sal and the students. Some of the key issues involved the following, and here I mentioned the things that most people are aware of, some of the problems that the students talked with Sal and which ultimately would lead to the demands of the blowouts. Things like the lack of students going on to college, the way that the counselors did not encourage them to think about college, the tracking system, of course. Sal remembers in Lincoln High School, the boys being assigned to make literally coffins, low reading levels, overcrowded conditions, the lack of bilingual education. Interestingly, Sal says, did Sal use Spanish in the schools? Hell yes, he says. My ideas in teaching were different. I was always hearing a different drummer. Corporal punishment, that comes out very clearly in the walkout film. The question of history, and here I want to just read a little bit about this. Adding to the insecurity and low esteem of the students, Sal believes was the total absence in history and social science classes of the historical and cultural contributions of people of Mexican descent. Sal himself had not learned about this in his own educational experience. However, while attending LA City College, he came across Carrie McWilliams' North from Mexico, first published in 1948. Reading McWilliams significantly affected his historical consciousness and his evolving critique of U.S. society, especially regarding the treatment of minorities. This view of history, including the integration of Mexican-American history into his own classes in the 60s, extended into his dialogues with students at Hess Kramer in order to promote ethnic and cultural pride. Vicky Castro, for example, recalls that she learned about Chicano and Mexican history at the conferences. Reflecting this critical perspective, one female student at the 1967 conference explained at the General Assembly, how can we as Chicanos find out who we are when our textbook labeled Pancho Villa a criminal? And still another at the same conference provided a form of internal colonial interpretation remarkable in this pre-Chicano studies period by rejecting a suggestion that Mexican Americans were immigrants to the US when she added, when you say we came to America, that's not right because America came to us, because Mexicans were here first. As part of the pedagogy of the oppressed, Freire advanced the concept of problem-solving education. By this he meant that traditional education that upheld the ideology of the oppressors had to be challenged by an education that focused on the problems of human beings and their relations with the world. In this process, the people, or in this case Sal and the students, through dialogue would be able to, as Freire puts it, name their oppressor. Naming the oppressor meant understanding the causes of their problem and not just the symptoms. As a result, they would, as Richard Schall asserts in his foreword to pedagogy, realize that the educational system today, from kindergarten to university, is their enemy. This shift to a problem-solving education characterized the Hess-Kramer conferences. Through dialogue, the students, with Sal's critical intervention, came to name the source of their problems, the educational system. Sal stresses that by arriving at a positive self-image of themselves and their self-confidence as a result of the conferences, the Chicano students would go on ahead and know who the real enemy was and go on to achieve and go on to college. The reason why kids were aware is because of the Hess-Kramer camps. They knew what the problems were, and they knew that sooner or later something was going to happen. It is through the pedagogy of dialogue, according to Freire, that a critical consciousness, or concientización, is arrived at. Freire defines concientización as learning to perceive social, political, and economic contradictions and to take action against the oppressive elements of reality. Such critical awareness is real consciousness. And this is in many ways what begins to happen at the students. Concientización through dialogue in turn leads to the subjectivity of the people and students. They move from being objects to becoming subjects. Instead of being for others, they become beings for themselves. As subjects, they create history. The result is the emergence of a new man and a new woman. As historical subjects, these new men and women are moved to fulfill a practice that Freire defines as reflection and action upon the world in order to transform it. Theory and practice are brought together. As the Youth Leadership Conferences continued into the 60s, this subjectivity in practice became more evident, culminating in the 1968 blowouts. Let me just move quickly to my conclusion. Before that, let me say, Sal concludes that the conferences were the backbone of the blowouts, Sal concludes, because the kids had discussed the problems there. Indeed, the effects of the blowouts can be seen in the 1968 conference program. By the way, the 1968 conference came a month after the blowouts, so the 67 conference is a very crucial one. Indeed, the effects of the blowouts can be seen in the 1968 conference program that directly addressed the walkouts and that utilized much more critical perspectives, including referring to Mexican Americans as a conquered people as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo following the US-Mexico War of the 1840s. The school walkouts and rioting that has been going on in our country means that something is wrong in our society, the 1968 program reads. Because of the walkouts and the rioting, good leadership is needed to right wrongs, build a better society, and a healthy share of this leadership must come from Mexican American youth. My conclusion, let me conclude by saying that what I have learned about the youth leadership conferences from my interviews with Sal Castro reinforces my understanding and that of others that the conferences serve to politicize a new generation of Chicano students who participated not only in the blowouts, but in the Chicano movement as a whole. My oral history substantiates the importance of Sal Castro's role in the conferences through his work and discussions with the students, including his sharing his own experiences with discrimination and his views that the educational system had to be confronted ultimately through nonviolent direct action such as the blowouts. But I've also learned through my oral history that it wasn't just Sal and the conferences themselves that led to this politicization and critical consciousness on the part of the students. The students themselves, through engaging in a form of Freirean dialogue, served as historical subjects in the development of a progressive and oppositional praxis. The demands of the blowouts were reforms, Juan Gomez Quiñones notes. Nonetheless, they reflected opposition to cultural and national oppression. While the blowouts began a process of change in the educational system, they did not fully transform it. Many more struggles would be needed, as they still are. But what the Camp Hess-Kramer conferences and the blowouts changed was the consciousness of the students themselves. As the character of Paula says in the film Walkout, when confronted with a lack of change, nothing may have changed, but I've changed. It is this spirit of critical consciousness and the struggle for social justice that is the legacy of the Camp Hess-Kramer conferences and the blowouts. This is also the legacy of a remarkable individual, teacher, counselor, and leader, Sal Castro. Thank you very much.
Thank you both. We're going to have to take a break now. We've gone well over the program time, but you're going to have an hour for lunch. I'd like to have all of the panelists